Hello, and welcome to another teaching from 2536. Today we're going to explore the identity of the Mother of Harlots, the one who's mentioned in Revelation 17:5. Spoiler alert, contrary to popular belief, she is not the Catholic Church. The prophet Hosea identifies the Mother of Harlots as the her we're commanded to come out of. This command was given to those the Father refers to as my people, those to whom he also said, "If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves, and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and heal their land." In other words, heal their inheritance. In the story of Hosea, we see how chapters 1, 2, and 3 lays out the foundation of what will happen to Israel, a message that begins at Mount Sinai on the third day. This is where and when the marriage of the Father's people is to take place. But what we read here in Hosea 2:2 is a declaration of the end of the marriage, not the beginning. Why? Because of his death, burial, and resurrection. In fact, Hosea rises with a massive proclamation. "Bring charges against your mother. Bring charges, for she is not my wife, nor am I her husband." And this is the foundation of the message given to the children. When the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord." It's here in Deuteronomy 32 where we read how the Father sent his Son to enter into an ungodly covenant and to have children born of that covenant. And what was the name of the harlot Hosea was committed to marry? And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. Now let's read what Isaiah had to say about her offspring. "But come here, you sons of the sorceress, you offspring of the adulterer and the harlot. Whom do you ridicule? Against whom do you make a wide mouth and stick out your tongue? Are you not children of transgression, offspring of falsehood?" When we come to an understanding of these verses, we'll be able to understand why Paul compares the covenant from Horeb and the children thereof to Abraham and Sarah working in the flesh, bearing offspring who ridicule the children of promise. And this is why Galatians 3 begins by taking us back to Deuteronomy 32. So if we're able to hold on to this understanding, we'll be able to correctly identify the her, the my people, are to come out of, which will eventually lead us to when Christ took a walk to Emmaus. "And when the eyes of the men were opened, with the breaking of bread." If we follow the breadcrumbs, meaning if we look up and study all the passages having to do with bread, and remembering that Christ took the bread and broke it, making two halves, then it should lead us to when the Lamb was slain, according to the promise made to Abraham and the walk between the pieces. This is revealed to us in Hosea chapter 1, where we learn Gomer's father's name, which is Debalim, which means two cakes, or two breads. Now I hope that made a very important connection for you, but just in case, let me explain. The children of Israel entered into the covenant of promise on day 1 at Mount Sinai, but then they broke that covenant on day 3. So according to the requirements of the walk between the pieces covenant, the father was obligated to slay his son. And when he did, the works of the covenant of promise were finished from the foundation of the world, which is what we read here in Hebrews 4:3. In other words, the bread of life, which is the covenant of promise, was broken, cut in two. Now the Father has two breads, Diblaim. The Father kept the portion of the promise, but he sent the other half to enter into a marriage, a covenant, with the now adulterous children. Adulterous? Yes, adulterous. Because they were legally bound, betrothed to their first love on the first day at Mount Sinai. But then they refused to consummate the marriage on the third day by building their house upon the rock. Instead, they rejected the gospel, the good spoken, the word born of the Father. And this should bring clarity to what Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, and how they had accepted the gospel, but then were turning away to build their faith with a different gospel, which is not another. And isn't this exactly what we see today in Christianity? How they accept the idea of Christ, but then reject the word born of the Father, and build their faith on the words of men. Yes, this was the Son, the word born of the Father, but the glory begins to fade away from this half of the bread as soon as he becomes a curse. So how does a heavenly being become a curse? It's by adding the things of the earth to the things from above, which is the spiritual understanding of what it means to mix fabrics. This is why religious doctrines are the abominations of the earth. It was the mixing of the Word born of the Father into the law contained in ordinances that resulted in the Lamb being slain from the foundation of the world. The word world is translated from the Greek word cosmos, which means ordered or arranged system. Now there are many ordered systems in the universe, but the context of Hebrews 4:3 is specifically referring to before the creation of the sacrificial system, not before the creation of the universe. This is why Christ tells us that his suffering beginning at Moses, because this is when the promise to Abraham, that his descendants would be a holy nation, was going to be fulfilled. But the children of Israel foolishly rejected the word that came from the voice of the Father, in favor of the word that came from Moses. Thus the Lamb, the Word born of the Father, the bread of life, was slain, broken, cut in two before the foundation of the orderly, arranged, sacrificial system contained within the Book of the Law Covenant was ratified. This should bring to mind Revelation 13:8, and how the names were written in the Book of Life according to the covenant of promise just before the foundation of the orderly, arranged sacrificial system, which took place at Mount Sinai on the third day. In other words, the Son is the bread. He's the gospel. He's the law. So when the Son, the law, was transgressed by the children of Israel, the Father had to slay him according to the terms of the covenant of promise in the walk between the pieces. Now there were two breads. The Father kept one half, the true bread from heaven, and sent the other half, which is the bread that Moses gave, to Mary to enter into covenant with an adulterous people. We see this prophesied with the Father telling Hosea to take a wife of harlotry. So Paul asks the rhetorical question, what purpose then does the law serve? Why then the law contained in ordinances? The law contained in ordinances became a wall of separation between the Father and his people, and that wall would remain in place until the seed would come to whom the promise was made, which is the other half of the bread. And it's in John's account of the gospel where he describes the reformation of the bread. Yes, all those years later, at the appointed time, there was a reformation of the bread. The Father sent the bread from heaven to become flesh, to become one with himself on the cross. The author to the letter of the Hebrews tells us why this was done. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but he has appeared once for all of the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by a sacrifice of himself. Thus, Christ destroyed the middle wall of separation between the Father and us. Christ abolished the law contained in ordinances in his flesh to bring the two pieces back together as one, in order to reconcile both pieces to the Father through him. Christ died so that he could rise in purity, no longer being mixed with other fabrics, meaning the law would no longer have the handwriting of earthly ordinances attached. The Word would be just as he was in the beginning. Then, through his resurrection, the Word would become pure once again, and no longer a curse, which would allow him to proclaim, "Bring charges against your mother, bring charges, for she is not my wife, nor am I her husband. Let her put away her harlotries from her sight, the mixing of fabrics, and the adulteries from between her breasts, the mixing of covenants." So those who come out of her and into the light of Christ become holy, as he is holy, through baptism. They join Christ in his death, burial, and resurrection, rising out of the water, born from above, released from all their earthly covenants and pure, virgins. In other words, no more mixing fabrics, no more leavened bread. From the resurrection of the Son, there's to be no more leaven in the house, for the blood of the true Passover lamb has been applied to the doorposts of our heart. It's by sifting the Father's instructions through the heart and spirit of Christ, which is a heart and spirit of love, the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us, allowing us to see the truth, the spirit of the law, to remove the leaven from our heart. Christ tells us, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." So if we've studied to show ourselves approved, we'll be able to rightly divide the bread, the word of truth. We'll know exactly when, where, and why Moses gave this power and authority to the serpent. In other words, we'll know when, where, and why the serpent bruised the Son's heel to cause enmity. We'll know when, where, and how this enmity was resolved to put all things under the Son's feet when the serpent's head, or headship, was crushed by the Son's feet, making a public spectacle of him. Look, if we don't know all the events surrounding the Father's dividing of the word of truth, we just might find ourselves deliberately choosing to follow a way that seems right unto a man, but in the end will lead to death. We'll choose to eat raisin cakes instead of the daily bread. Yes, many will be rejected as priests and perish because of a lack of knowledge, having ignored the Father's law. But sadly, this doesn't keep those ignorant and unstable teachers from leading others into the error of lawlessness. This is why so many in Christianity are starving. They've rejected the bread that brings life. Instead, they eat the bread offered by men. This is the famine the prophet Amos warns us about. That there will be many who will deliberately seek to rebuild a marriage that was destroyed at the cross, choosing to keep on sinning after coming to the knowledge of the truth. But there will be just as many more who will completely reject both halves of the bread. They'll ignore God's law, the word by which the promise was made, showing just how cunning the enemy really is. There are three types of disciples. There's the legalist, the liberalist, and the faithful. The legalist, or lordship disciple, strictly follows a written code of religious doctrine. They do this through the circumcision of their flesh and the works of their hands. But sadly, they'll never get their field plowed in time to sow any seed, because religion is only able to sanctify the flesh, not the heart. In other words, they check the boxes in the same way the Pharisees, and thus eventually conform into the image of a Pharisee. This happens because they're building their faith in their own faithfulness to perform their religious rituals and traditions. This produces bad fruit, fruit that looks like pride, self-righteousness, and judgment, and they'll cast that judgment over anyone who doesn't keep the law or their doctrines in the same way they do. Then there's the liberalist, who believes that obedience is unimportant because they're justified by grace. The liberalist demonstrates how faith without works is dead, because all their fruit is choked out by the weeds. Since they don't stand in the truth of the Father's word, they're easily deceived by the cunning of the enemy and are moved by every wind of doctrine in order to conform into the image of those who influence them. Finally, there's the faithful disciple, who is born of the Spirit and knows that the sowing of their field must be harnessed to and dependent on the grace of the Father, which is the power of the Holy Spirit. This is the one who consumes the Word to allow the Word to transform them into the image of Christ in order to produce a crop 30, 60, or 100-fold. It will be the legalist and the liberalist who will hear Christ proclaim, "I never knew you," for they have both built their faith on the sand, which are the doctrines and traditions of men. But it will be the faithful disciple, the one who builds their faith on the rock, which is the word born of the Father, who will hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." May you be blessed in your pursuit of truth. Shalom.